Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Litsa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Litsa. How's it going, Litsa?
It's going pretty well. I like how I'm always surprised. You always ask that question, and every time I'm like, oh, how am I doing? How's it going? Everything is going all right, reasonably uneventful-ish. I don't know. I have some family things with my mom's health that has been a little stressful, but other than that, okay.
Coincidentally, you and I had not discussed this, but I too had some things with my dad's health that was really, they came up last night. So that's why we haven't discussed it. But that's interesting that that's what you say, because that's definitely what's been on my mind this morning. I don't know. This is something, not to make it about my dad or your mom or anything, but like, I just feel like as we get older, it's something that feels like more and more of a source of anxiety. I think like since my mom died, we all in my family have learned to take like signs very seriously, and maybe we tend to jump to them as being red flags more quickly than we really ought to. It's that thing where you had a loved one who had a sign that they didn't get checked out, and who knows if that would have changed things, and you always wonder. And so now, of course, every time something happens, what's the worst case scenario? Like that's something that I think a lot of people do, especially people who have experienced a loved one who has died. And so I think I automatically do that. But then there's that added layer that as I get older, like the odds of something being negative feel more realistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like my dad is older. My siblings are all getting older. I'm getting older. And so it's not necessarily that my fears are all grounded in like paranoia. It's like, well, no, like I'm at that age where certain things start to become more and more possible. And so are a lot of the people I love. And I think that that's something that's recently like really shifted for me. And I don't know. I don't know what the feeling that I have behind it. I don't know like the best word to describe it, but it's unpleasant. I think it's the best word I can think of. It's uncomfortable. It's worrisome.
No, I think it's really true. And I think when you have gone through something where you realize that someone who is relatively young gets diagnosed and it can be a sign, then certainly when people are older, it's like, oh, wow, well, this definitely could be the worst. So yeah. I get that. I think also for me, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that having had a parent who died so young. I mean, I was 18, but my dad was 52. And that, is pretty young. And I think it's interesting because then I feel like I'm so grateful that my mom has been okay, but also maybe nobody processes this until it's happening, but I don't think I like really had understood or processed the idea of what it would feel like to just see my mom aging and like to deal with that. I think that for a long time, I've always held my breath that like something unexpected would also happen to my mom when she was younger that I don't know. I don't know. Like I've worried about that so much that I think I hadn't really done a lot of anticipatory grief just around like as your parents age. And I don't know. I've been more aware of it as it is something like I agree. My mom now is at the age where she really is having stuff happen both physically and cognitively that is scary and that's really hard for her and for us. And it's just, I'm like, wow, of course I should have been thinking about this, but somehow I don't know. I guess until it's happening, it's hard to really imagine it happening.
Yeah, I agree. And I think your mom is a lot like my dad. They're very like active.
Yes.
They're very young for their age. And so it's especially hard, I think, to consider the idea of them being unable to do things the way that they've always done them and unable to be present in the way that they've always been present. And I know I'll speak for my dad, and I think your mom too, are a little resistant to kind of accepting that, and that's fine. I'm totally totally supportive of that. I have siblings who I think are a little more cautious, and maybe they're the ones who see, who are there on a more day-to-day basis, and understand that limitations come with age. Obviously, it's just the way life is. But I don't know, and I agree. I definitely agree that it's really hard, and it means that you're aging too, and all the people we love are aging too, and that's a whole thing. And as some people have mentioned in the chat, like it's really hard when you only have that one parent for whatever reason. The idea of losing them is really really scary, because they're for many people, one of the only people they have, or one of the closest people they have, or one of the people who's been there forever, whatever role
Yeah.
that person fills.
Who's like been grounding you in different ways. And I think sometimes, as Jennifer just said in the chat too, like sometimes when you've lost someone else important to you, a
Yeah.
partner or another significant loss, and if your parents, no matter what your age is, have been grounding you and your support and helped you and, whatever that is in those other ways, I think whether it's parents or anybody else, like those
Yeah.
people become more precious almost because
Mhm.
we've lost someone and we're now aware we can lose people really close to us. And we feel like those are the people who have helped to get us through. So then what will it mean to like lose the people who've helped to get us
Yeah.
through? Which I guess, is not unrelated to what we wanted to talk about today. I mean,
Yeah.
not the smoothest transition from parents to friends, but I think thinking about friend loss, and that's what we wanted to talk about today, was the death of a friend, largely prompted by me because this has been on my mind a lot lately. And I think sometimes for me, and I've talked about this a bit before, like I am definitely someone where found family is very real for me, and where I don't have a ton of siblings, but I am very grateful
Mhm.
to have friends who feel like siblings and who have friends who have really been just like a big grounding force in my life in different ways. And oftentimes have been people who have sort of felt like the secure grounding place for me. And so I think now one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last 4 years, I've had 4 friends die, all completely unexpectedly. Like none of them got a diagnosis of an illness and something happened. Like all of them were completely sudden, unexpected deaths. And so it has had me thinking a lot about just the nature
Mhm.
of when friends die, and maybe specific to me, the nature of when friends die when they have sort of been people who have been there for you throughout other losses and things. So yeah, I don't know. It's just an interesting space that I don't know that friendship loss gets talked about, in my experience, nearly as much as it should, considering we all have friends and we're all getting
Right.
older and we're all going to die.
What? Um,
Surprise.
I think you're right. I don't think that friend loss gets quite the amount of support and attention as it really ought to. And I think if I could put one reason on that, it's just because I think friendship relationships are one of those relationships where they really run the gamut, from kind of very distant friends to friends that are very, very close. And I do think oftentimes when it's a friend that dies, people may make the assumption that its magnitude isn't as significant as if someone else who was a closer, like, let's say, relation dies. People assume it's not going to have that impact because maybe they're thinking about their types of friendships, or maybe they assume that person wasn't a huge part of your life. And what we know, of course, is that sometimes we have friends who we talk to every single day of our lives, that we see constantly, that we sometimes maybe even live next to, work with, things like that. And so the death of a friend is something that can really be a very deep loss. But I think it sometimes gets kind of like washed out by the fact that there are all these different degrees of connection when it comes to friendships. And so for that reason, I think that friendship grief often gets very disenfranchised. When somebody hears that like a friend died, they're like, oh, I'm sorry. But it's not like they say to themselves, I need to, really check in with that person in a month, that I need to mark this down as something I need to like reach out in a year when this time of year comes around. People don't really treat it in the exact same way. I'm not saying always. There may be people who do treat it that way, and there may be people who are grieving a friend loss who are fairly able to communicate like, this is a big deal to me, and they have people who listen to them, right? But I do think in general, this tends to be one of those losses that gets quite minimized.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, obviously one of the reasons I'm a big supporter that jobs should have bereavement, well, that of course jobs should have bereavement leave. But in addition to
Right.
that jobs should have bereavement leave policies where we get to determine who are the important people in our lives who we need bereavement leave for. Jobs don't most jobs don't give you even a day off if you lose a friend, right? It's
Right.
always like these immediate family members, and that's what is prioritized. And so I think in addition to what you said about it being disenfranchised by other people, I think there's a lot of self disenfranchisement sometimes for the same reason of like levels of different friendships. And, suddenly I think there is a feeling of like, oh, well, if this person had closer friends, or I have closer friends that are not, they're not my closest friends, why is this impacting me so much? Or do I deserve this grief in the way that I'm experiencing it? That I think is something that can come up for a lot of people, is feeling like we're just not as sure what our right to grieve is, because oftentimes we have internalized all those messages. And so I certainly, I think recently, and having gone through these losses over the last few years, two of them were friends who are much closer. And two of them, as were people who were good friends for me, but people who I met through work, who I worked with, and who we worked with, and who I think because of the nature of the friendships we had, I didn't talk to them every day, but I certainly had dinner with them a couple of times a month after we lost that job, kept in touch, texted, like they were people who I think helped me through certain difficult things, and who I helped through certain difficult things. And yet I like really felt myself in this place of feeling like, wow, should I be this impacted by this? Why am I this impacted by these losses? Minimizing myself. And I'm like, if I, of all people, was doing this, like where I'm somebody who certainly in all cases spends a lot of my time trying to help people feel confident and validated that we are deserving of our grief, no matter the nature of the relationship, I found myself deep in that and feeling like, oh, well, they probably have better friends and closer family. And I like, what does that even mean? I don't know. I'm having my own experience. And yet it was something that really came up for me.
I think that's something that we automatically do. Like you said, like you intellectually know better, but I do think that we automatically say to ourselves, like, okay, X type of relationship equals Y amounts of grief, or this is the amount of grief you're kind of entitled to. And I think when you're a friend, you're also like very aware you're not the family, you're not the next of kin, you're not they're necessarily planning arrangements and things like that. You're kind of a visitor at the arrangements. You're calling on the family, and so you're more distant than you may feel like deep down. And so I think that we often think like, oh, this amount of closeness should equal this amount of grief, and what we know is that it's just not like that. Like you feel what you feel, and it brings things up for such a wide range of reasons. And I almost feel like those more distant connections, the people that you really love, but you don't talk to as often, you don't see as often, like it's almost harder to wrap your head around that, because they are just like a phone call away, but it's like you didn't talk to them every week. So it's harder to kind of really wrap your head around and digest the fact that they aren't there anymore.
Yeah, well, because I think no matter what it is, we do have this tendency to want to somehow quantify the relationship in some way.
Yeah.
And I do think it's hard to not have a tendency to do that. And so with more distant relationships, that becomes even more complex, like closer friendships. Like when I say I do have, friends who I feel like they feel like siblings to me, right? Like they're that close.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like I'm giving that friendship more weight because I'm like, oh, but it's like family. And I think when it's like a more distant friend, and like in these cases, when I say distant, they weren't like, I
Yeah.
don't know, they weren't like my like distant
But
social media friends.
they were always like there, and
There,
like it
yeah.
almost feels like they should still be that phone call away, like
Yes,
um
totally.
it it's just a different type of
It's
connection, and I think
yes,
that the fact that we quantify connections in the first place may be where we start to go wrong. You know what I mean? Like the
absolutely.
quality or of
Right.
a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that was true in these two friendships is like both of them were friendships where I think we, even though frequency, I wasn't like talking to them every day necessarily, but like I think with both of them went through some relatively like difficult things with them, like in a way that, again, I think, I hate to reinforce this quantifying thing, but that sometimes creates closeness and intimacy with people, like when we
Mhm.
go through really difficult stuff with them in some way. And so I think that was one piece of this that made it really complicated for me, where I was like, I don't know, these relationships had
Yeah.
a weight. But I think the other thing that you mentioned that has felt very true for me is that we talk about, like in Mary Frances O'Connor's research and her book, The Grieving Brain, about that idea of, our brain maps the world and sort of is a predicting machine that is looking for people
Mhm.
in the world. And then as time passes after a loss, we start to kind of remap the world with less expectation to see them, right? Like the car that you hear outside, you start to not automatically assume that it's your
Mhm.
spouse or your parent if it as time passes. But I think what you mentioned about the fact that with friendships, especially friendships where they're not necessarily every day, seeing them every day, talking to them every day, friendships, it's like our brain doesn't have
Yeah.
the ability to remap in the same way because there wasn't that predictable spot that they were always in. It wasn't like, oh, here's where I'm expecting to see them sitting in their chair. It's sort of a different way that they existed for us internally. And so I think for much longer, in a lot of ways, I experienced that feeling of like wanting to send a text. I mean, I have like,
Yeah.
feelings uh, with Aaron, who died, but it's been 4 years this month, where I still am taken aback by how often I see things and still have the thought like, oh, I'm going to text this to Aaron. And I think part of it is because of that, like the
Mhm.
remapping of the world is happens in a different way and on a different timeline.
Yeah.
I think that's also because Erin was like a grief therapist and I got her feedback a lot of times for different things that I was like thinking about or stuff with what's your grief or different things. So it's also just true that I see a lot of things that remind me
Mhm.
of her. But
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about that, like that difference in remapping the world when it's a friendship who, isn't somebody who you would have been seeing every single day in your world. It changes the nature of expectations.
I think another thing that makes this a different type of experience, grief and loss wise, and I'm just kind of guessing about this for you because I know that you are often in the role of being a supportive person for people who are grieving. And I think when you're a friend, there's that thing of saying to yourself, well, there's the family and they have it worse, right? And
Yeah.
they need my support. So you're in that middle space where you have your own grief, but then also you see the people who are like maybe family, depends on the person and the situation and their relationships, but you see people who were very very close to them, maybe family, and you think, well, I need to be a support person, not the grieving person, right? It's like that great, I cannot remember the source of it now, that idea of when you're grieving, you
Oh,
dump
the ring.
out, not in, right?
Yes,
You
the
don't
ring.
ever Yeah, so there's the concentric circles and the
Ring theory.
the ring theory. So the rings that are closest to the loss, and then there are rings coming out from there, and you can never dump your grief into the closer rings, right? You only dump your grief out to people who are more distant from the loss. Sorry, that's a terrible summary, but it's a great it's a great conceptualization of it.
We'll link to it. It
Yeah,
was originally posted probably 10
a
years ago
long
in the
time
LA
ago.
Times. Yeah.
People have probably seen it, but it's really very smart. But yeah, I think there's this idea that like I cannot express my grief necessarily. Like you can, but you can't kind of dump in. You can't lay it all on the people who are closest. So it's like I need to be able to be that support person for them, but I'm also grieving. So it's an interesting kind of dual role, I think. Have you found that with your losses that you mentioned?
So it's really interesting. I think part of the reason, again, this episode, like maybe in some of the instances of my losses, I don't know that they're as generalizable, because I do think that that's true in a lot of situations. Interestingly, I think in the situations with especially these two losses at the beginning of COVID, they had more complicated relationships with their families. And so it was interesting because I think I felt that way more around other friends who I felt like were sort of their closer friends or their more affected friends. Because it was interesting to see that sort of play out, because they didn't have as traditional relationships with their families. And because it was the beginning of COVID, neither of them had funerals. And so that was also another layer to all of this. But I certainly felt that feeling, but more with like taking care and checking in on the people, on like the closer friends who I felt like I perceived as more affected and therefore more in need of support, which I do think really I had to like keep that in check for myself. And it was interesting because in both cases, right, these were people who were both grief social workers. Yeah. Many of their friends were also therapists, counselors, social workers, many of whom also worked in grief. So it was interesting to see the dynamics playing out of everybody wanting to support everyone else and yet everybody struggling. I think that was a real dynamic that was happening. And, and then in case of my other two friends who died later, I just didn't have really a relationship with their family. I didn't know their family, and they were a couple, and they both died a year apart from each other, both unexpectedly. And then didn't have kids and had, siblings who they were close with, but I didn't really know them. And so it was really also a different dynamic in the sense that of just feeling kind of distant from their families. Yeah. So yeah, for me, I don't know that my experience recently has been very reflective of the other people other friendship losses, because they've been sort of slightly unique dynamics that I've been trying to sort through.
Nikki shares something that I'm glad she said, because I wanted to highlight this in the chat, that she finds comfort when her friends express their grief for the loss of her daughter. When they cry and share their pain, it reminds her of how much she is loved. And thank you for saying that. And that was an important caveat that I wanted to sort of put on this, because I would never mean to say like we can't express our grief and our sorrow that someone's loved one has died. And I think, like Nikki said, I think that is kind of comforting to know that this person was so loved and had such an impact on the world, sharing those memories and how they touched your life. I remember after my mom died, like we only knew her as our mom. She had 6 kids and my dad traveled a ton. She didn't get out much. And so it was so nice to interact with so many people who had been impacted. She was a nursery school teacher, and like so many people came and shared their stories of like how she touched their lives as like little kids or their kids and things like that. And that meant so much to us. So I do think that it is incredibly helpful to know how a person has impacted friends and community members and people beyond. So I do think that there is definitely a space to share your grief. And I actually encourage people to share those thoughts. I really think that they will treasure it. I can't promise you that. I can't guarantee you that. But I think that it's worth the shot because so many people do really, really treasure those words from people who are kind of in that person's life.
Oh yeah, I can't even count the number of people who I think have told us over the years how after the person in their life died, they learned like all these stories and all these kind of worlds that this person occupied that they didn't know about, or ways that they'd impacted other people, and through friendships or relationships with colleagues or other things they did that were so incredibly meaningful. And I do think sometimes because we will, especially with those more distant relationships, we'll sort of disenfranchise ourselves or think, oh, was this not that meaningful? Or, they were, I don't know, whatever you think. Oh, we were just in a book club together. We were just coworkers, or, whatever it is. Like, we have a tendency to minimize the impact of the relationship and what a family member would care to hear about. But I think so often after someone is gone, people just want to hear everything. I mean, again, also can't promise, but usually I think most people are just so happy to learn about the ways that the person was impacting other people, hear stories they don't know, feel like that person is going to live on through all these other people who they impacted in all these different ways and all these different memories. I think all of that is really important and can be really helpful as somebody who is grieving. If you are a friend, I think sometimes it can feel nice to be able to have a way to put down some of those memories, if it's, sending a card or sending a note or a message, even if you don't know the family well, and feeling confident to do that. I think sometimes because people get nervous around what are the norms and expectations in grief and how do we do things, people sometimes get uncomfortable about sending messages or sending cards if they didn't know the family. But I think those messages and cards can go a really long way, and as a friend can be really helpful to just like have a space to put that down and send it to other people.
I think one thing when it has to do with a friend, and I can't say that this is true for everybody, but it's something that I do think I've seen come up quite a bit just in my personal life and then in our work, is when somebody who's a friend dies, it's often somebody who's around your age or your stage of life a lot of the time. And so I do think that sometimes what comes up is something that we're really hesitant to mention because it feels really self-focused. But I do think when a friend dies, a lot of times something that comes up for people is just those existential feelings about their own life and their own death. Because if somebody your age in a similar stage of life can die, then that means that so can you. And what would that look like for your family and friends? And, so I do think that it's something, I think anytime someone dies, it brings up questions of our own mortality. And we're usually really hesitant and afraid to mention that because it feels very selfish. But I do think it's worth mentioning. I think it makes people kind of re-examine and step back and start thinking about some of these things.
I agree. I really loved that on one of his recent albums. I know I shared this in our newsletter like a couple of years ago. Bruce Springsteen, his whole album was sort of dedicated to his grief around this experience of having lost bandmates from his early band, but where he is now the only living surviving member of his original band from when he was back in high school. And, he really kind of openly reflected on the mortality piece of that, right? Like that, of course, these losses were devastating of these people who meant so much and represented this time in his life, and went back to childhood friendships, which is obviously something huge when friendships withstand so many decades and all the changes in life, but also where he was very open about his own mortality and what it feels like to suddenly realize you're losing friends around you, that you're losing that shared history together, you're losing memories. It feels like the end of, specific eras of your life, but also that it makes it more and more real with each of those losses that are awareness of our own death. And I do think that we feel that, yeah, intensely with friendships when they happen. My grandmother, when I cleaned out my grandmother's house after my grandmother died, and she was 93. And she had this was like, she had a phone stand out in the hallway, like the old fashioned kind of phone stand where you could, and it had all the notepad and everything right next to the phone. I remember going through and just kind of flipping through her phone number book that was next to the phone. And all the way through, next to people's names, she had the date of death. And it was just like, at 93, it was unbelievable how many of the names and pages in this telephone book had these dates of death next to it. And it was, I don't know, it was just such a moment of thinking like, right, that's what happens when you're lucky enough to live to 93. It also means that you've had to survive the grief and the loss of all of these people who have been part of your life. And I don't know, it's always stayed with me. That was when I was like 21 that I did that, and I cleaned my grandmother's house out, and it's always stayed with me when I think about loss of friendships and how they just start to stack up over our lives, really.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the longer that we exist, the more loss we're going to accumulate and carry with us. And as we know, like, we don't just put those things behind us. We do carry these things forward. And so I think that our relationship with grief and loss, it naturally evolves and grows in many ways. And I just think it's important to kind of normalize that loss in general, it can cause us to really reevaluate our worldview, because it calls into question a lot of the assumptions and beliefs that we have about how the world works and about how safe we are and how long we have. And so I do think it's just important to note that any loss can cause us to really reevaluate and reassess our worldviews. And that's a very normal and natural thing. It might not be something we're comfortable opening up to everybody about, but it's definitely normal if that's what's kind of going on for you at any point.
I think that the other piece of this that is interesting and different than just our own mortality, but it is part of like our own identity. I think when we think about any relationship, and this is true of friendship too, there is like the person who we are in that friendship, like with that person. And there's, again, the shared memories that you have together, that like shared history. And I think that for me, I think maybe some of the friendship losses that I've experienced over the last few years have made me even more aware of that. I think a lot of times when we talk about identity and roles, we think of them in very clear ways, right? Like, what does it mean to my role as a wife when my husband dies, or my role as a parent when my child dies, and coming to terms with what it means to have that relationship with someone who's died and what our role is. But again, with friendship, I think there's sort of a less defined role, because friendships are all so different. And not that all relationships aren't so different, but you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't always crystallize in my mind in the same way. And I think that losing those friendships has made me more aware of just, the pieces of oneself that you realize, oh, like this person who I did these very particular types of things with, or who kind of occupied this very particular space in my life, or who I talked to about these, was my go-to person for these things. Like, when they're gone, you start to really see more clearly exactly what they were.
I think with identity, like, kind of like you said, like, we think of it as being kind of our own thing. Like, this is something that feels very separate, but like you said, there are things that you only want to do if you can do with that person, or that you only enjoyed because you shared them with that person. And this isn't just unique to friendships. Of course, this is unique to any relationship, so I think that it's interesting, because I think we do see how intertwined our identity is with other people, and how much, maybe was us and how much was them and how much was, us together. And that's kind of an interesting thing. I don't want to do What's Your Grief without you, Litsa. So if you ever go away, not die, if you ever leave. it will be the end of this because
It'll be
we
the
did this
end. No,
together, and
that's
that's why
true.
I like doing it.
Same.
So, yeah, and I also think there's that shared history piece too, that's a part of our identity. It's that idea of who we were, in our history. Like I only have a few friends that go back really far, and that's why they're so special, because they're the one person who will get this ridiculous joke about the 90s, that we shared. And so I do think that there's that piece too. Like they're the only ones who really knew you when.
Yeah.
And so it's sad when you no longer have that connection.
Well, and I think it's layered too on the fact that as we get older, it becomes harder to make friends.
Yes.
And that's well documented that into adulthood, it becomes harder and harder to make friends. And so when we lose friends, I think, that there is often that feeling of I've lost someone so important to me. And I also may in other ways already be struggling with the difficulty making friendships or feeling more lonely or isolated, as life gets busier. As people get older, it just becomes harder. There's fewer places. The number of hours it takes to, they say, make a good friendship, like that you have to put in for someone to feel like a good friend, just logistically is harder as we're the older that we get, to put in that kind of time. So I think that it can really amplify that feeling of just how much it meant to have that good friend with a shared history who just knew these things. And you start to think, oh, even with my other friends, it'll never be that. Even, new friends will never be that. And of course, no one is ever replaceable. But I think sometimes we can really feel the weight of it a lot if we're already struggling with not having a lot of close new friendships in adulthood.
Right. And I do think that there are people who feel like they have a ton of friends, and then there are people who feel like they have a very small group of close friends. That's how I feel. And so losing a friend, I think, increases that sense of loneliness, that sense of not having people, because you have such a small group to begin with. And so I do think that, not that it isn't hard for both types of people, but I could certainly see how for some it really increases that sense of like, I don't have anyone. I'm, feeling very lonely and alone. So I definitely think that is a very true reality. That is hard to find your people in life, I think, sometimes. And sometimes it's that shared history. It's those years that we put in a long time ago that keeps us connected, to people who you might not otherwise have connected with in adulthood, and forge those friendships. So
yeah, and in the chat, important comment came in that I think is so true and so hard, of that it's not always that we lose friendships because of deaths, that sometimes we lose friendships for other reasons. And one of the common ones can be that people disappear on us after going through another loss. And I mean, we've written before about losing friendships, both as a result of loss, but also as a result of just falling out and estrangement. And I mean, there's so many reasons that we lose and grieve people. And so today we have really been focusing on friendships that are after someone dies, but there's a whole lot we could say too about friendships, losing friendships in other ways.
I think we actually did a podcast, and then not like it might have been a little while ago, but I think I remember doing one. It might have been a little after COVID and after the election year. There were a lot of people writing to us about losing friendships over differing beliefs and things like that. And so I definitely remember that we did a podcast about that. We can maybe link to that in the show notes, because it is, like you said, it's a whole other conversation. And it's one that I think has a lot of complicated emotion attached to it, because you feel also a sense of kind of maybe betrayal or disappointment in other people, or, a lack of trust. And there's a lot of really complicated feelings that come along. If you're the one who maybe separates yourself from a friend, I think there's a lot of grief there, because you're kind of trying to decide, well, we just talked about how some of these people we have a shared history with, and maybe they're one of our only close friends. And it can be really hard to say, is that something I want to walk away from because of X, Y, or Z. And so there is so much that we could say about that. And maybe if we didn't do a good job in the last one, we can do another podcast on that.
Yeah. And I think with this, there's just in general with friendship, it's hard. Part of the reason I think it's even hard to talk about this in general is it is so unique, right? Like all of our friendship relationships, the dynamics are so unique and complex. But it is the reason that I think ultimately we just encourage people to give the space to their grief that they need for whatever that friendship was, whatever the nature of the relationship was, and to just try to, I think, tap into the ways that work for you to grieve those relationships. I think sometimes, again, with family, if you lose a family member, not all families grieve well together, but sometimes you do have some certain built-in things that it feels like people do to memorialize or acknowledge their birthday every year, or to, kind of do something. And I think with friendships, again, we don't always have, or we have even less of a template on how to do that. And so I think whether it's finding ways individually that you kind of create rituals that help you feel connected or feel like you're doing your own remembering, or initiate that with other friends of just saying like, hey, is there something we want to do? Or getting comfortable with that, even though it maybe is a little bit outside of the norm. I think, again, often it's looked at like those are things that families organize. So I think trying to find the things that work for you, I think, at least from my experience, that's been something that has been really helpful for me, has been just finding the personal continued bonds and rituals and connections, and like the ways for me that have felt like they are allowing some sort of ongoing connection, even though that has been a little bit more individual and hasn't been as connected to maybe other people or their families. I've been able to at least find some good comfort in that.
Yeah. Well, we will link to all these different articles and podcasts and things that we mentioned for anybody who wants more on this. And you can always reach out to us if you have any specific questions about this. We are on Facebook and Instagram at What's Your Grief. And you can always email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com.